Good morning and welcome to today's daily devotional. My name is Pastor Aaron, and I have the privilege of bringing to you God's Word today. We are in the Gospel of Matthew. In the Gospel of Matthew, we have found our way into Matthew chapter 24, also known as Jesus's Olivet Discourse, because he's giving all of this information from the Mount of Olives. And we started it in the last devotional. We're going to continue on with it today. Today we're going to be in Matthew chapter 24. We're only going to be covering 5 verses, Matthew 24 verses 15 through 20. The reason we're not covering very much today is because there's so much depth and so much history in the things that Jesus is saying that you have to have an understanding of what Jesus is referring to really be able to understand all of it going forward. Hopefully this will be meaningful today, and hopefully it will be helpful to you as we get deeper into God's Word. Let me give you a reminder of where we have come from. In chapter 24, Jesus is speaking of prophetic events. First, he talks about the destruction of the temple. He says that the temple, there won't be one stone left upon another in the temple. Now that would actually be fulfilled and happen in AD 70. In 67, or actually 66 AD, Rome attacked Israel. The Roman Empire attacked Israel because Israel had risen up and began to revolt against the Roman rule. In 66 AD, they attacked. In 67 AD, they took over Galilee. In 70 AD, they hit Jerusalem. They surrounded the temple. It was the last place to stand. They surrounded the temple. They destroyed the temple. They did not leave one stone upon another, just as Jesus had predicted. The presence of God after the ascension of Jesus had left Israel. The final destruction of Israel happened in 70 AD. Israel would no longer exist as a nation all the way for about 2,000 years until 1948, when the nation of Israel was reborn. When Israel was reborn in 1967, Israel then took back Jerusalem, finally having everything fulfilled. Actually, in 2017, President Trump, whether I don't care about your opinion on President Trump, but he fulfilled God's prophetic promises in 2017. When Trump moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it was the first time that a national leader since the rebirth of Israel had actually recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, thereby recognizing that Israel did exist as a nation. When he did that, it was a fulfillment that everything about Israel was finally restored. That is important in end times prophecy, that all of Israel had to come back into existence. It had been removed from existence. It had come back into existence in its entirety. And that was very, very important to happen. But Jesus predicted in 70 AD, it was fulfilled, that the temple would be destroyed. Then his disciples asked Jesus that important question when they said to him, "Tell us, when will these things be?" Jesus did not give them the specific date. It was not important to give them the specific date. There's been speculation of why was that. Maybe that Jesus did not want to reveal to the enemy, to Satan himself, what the dates would be. People often mistakenly think that Satan is all-knowing, all-powerful, ever-present. Those are only the 3 attributes given of God: the omnipresence, the omniscience, and the omnipotence of God. Those are 3 attributes that Satan does not have. He is not everywhere. He does not know everything, but he is a cunning enemy with a legion, forces around the world who do his bidding. He is a general, but he is not ever present. So when Jesus doesn't want to give that date out, it's not that Satan would ever know. He is not all-knowing. But the disciples say to Jesus, "Tell us when these things will be." Jesus says, "I'm not going to tell you the date, but I'm going to give you the evidences. Look for the signs. Be aware of the signs. Pay attention to the signs, and then you will know." They said to him, "What will be the sign of your coming? What will be the sign of the end of the age?" Jesus gives them the first part of that we covered last time. He says, "Here's what you're going to see. You're going to see that many will come in the name of Christ, and they will be deceivers. They will deceive many. They will lead people astray. You're going to hear of wars. You're going to hear of rumors of wars. Don't be troubled. These things have to happen. They're the beginning of the birth pains. They're the beginning of the contractions before the labor actually happens. You're going to see nation rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There's going to be famines. There's going to be pestilence and disease. There's going to be earthquakes. These are just the beginning of the earth, of the labor pains. The contraction phase has started. Then you're going to be taken into tribulation. They're going to deliver you up. The people who are followers of Christ are going to be hated for his name's sake. They're going to take people up. They're going to bring them before others, and they're going to be killed in the name of Jesus. Now, we aren't seeing that in the U.S. yet, but it is moving that direction. But they are seeing it around the world. It is happening around the world. There are going to be many false prophets who are going to lead people astray. It doesn't have to be false doctrines, it's just false belief systems. It can be anti-God belief systems that will lead people astray. Lawlessness will abound, love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. That's our calling, that's our purpose. You keep enduring, you keep persevering in Jesus, you keep hanging on to him, you keep believing his word, you will endure to the end, and you will be saved if that is your purpose and focus in life. Jesus says that what will happen is the gospel will be preached in all of the world as a witness to all the nations, then the end will come. We have the technology set up now for that to happen, that the gospel can be preached to all of the world because of our internet capability, our video conferencing capability, our videos that we can create. The gospel will be preached everywhere. Now, Jesus is going to continue on describing the flow. He's going to describe the flow of history until the coming of Jesus. And so we see the flow of history until Jesus returns continued on, starting in verse 15. Again, we're only going to go through verse 20 because there is so much information here that I have to explain to you and have to give you some knowledge of for your own sake and for your own understanding. Well, let's get into God's word today. Here's what it says. Starting in verse 15, and only verse 15 right now, and then let me speak to what is being talked about here by Jesus. Jesus continues on with the flow of what is going to happen before we see the Son of Man return. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet in the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, when you see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Here will be the sign that's going to happen. Here's what else has to happen before the Son of Man returns. You will also have to see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Now, essentially, the abomination of desolation speaks of the ultimate desecration of a Jewish temple, the establishment of an idolatrous image in the holy place itself, which will inevitably result in the judgment of God. It is the abomination that brings desolation, the abomination that brings literally destruction. Something abominable, some abomination has to happen, and it has to take place, he says, in the holy place. That is, standing in the Jewish temple. There has to be a temple in order for this to happen. You will see an abomination, a person who will bring destruction, bring God's judgment, and they have to be standing in the holy place of God, in the temple of God. Now, there are some theologians that believe that that's what happened in 70 AD when the Romans destroyed it. I don't believe that. I really believe, as do most theologians, that this is a futuristic event that Jesus is prophesying, and what he is prophesying about is the rebirth of the nation of Israel, the rebirth and the rebuilding of a third temple. Now, remember what I told you last devotional. There have been two temples, and there are plans for the third temple. The first temple happened in the time of Solomon. Solomon built the first temple. It was a glorious temple. It was an incredible temple. The second temple happened. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. They basically destroyed Israel. They destroyed the temple of God. They took the Israelites into captivity. Daniel, when he was writing his prophecy, was in captivity in Babylon. He had been taken captive by the Babylonian Empire, by King Nebuchadnezzar. The temple would be rebuilt. It would start with Nehemiah. If you look at the book of Nehemiah in the Old Testament, Nehemiah would come out of captivity in Babylon. He would come and he would rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, the protective barrier. Then Ezra and Zerubbabel would rebuild or start rebuilding the second temple. Herod, when he would come on the scene, this was about 400 years after, actually more than that, but there's a time period after Herod would come on the scene, and Herod would remodel the temple. He would expand the temple, he would glorify the temple, he would do great building projects of the temple. It would become an incredible thing. That's the second temple. The second temple would be destroyed by the Roman Empire in 70 AD. Israel would no longer exist as a nation. It would be now called Palestine. Palestine was a Roman name given to that land in that region. Palestine would lay dormant for centuries. There was always a small Jewish presence in that area, in that region, for all of those years, for almost 2,000 years. Their presence in the region was continuous, but it was small. It was very unthinkable that these Jewish people, in a small amount of numbers, would ever be able to rebuild a temple. Therefore, Jesus's prophecy can only be fulfilled if Israel would be regathered as a nation. In 1948, Israel was reborn as a nation. The restoration of that nation would also contribute to the plans for the third temple to be built. There are plans now underway for a third temple. The foundation has been prepared for the rebuilding of the third temple. When the third temple is rebuilt, the sacrificial system will occur. It doesn't mean that the temple has to be completely, it doesn't mean that it has to be completely finished. It just has to be started to be being rebuilt. An altar has to be created in order for the sacrifices to begin to happen again in Jerusalem. When that happens, an abomination, an abomination of desolation, will come into that place and begin the process of desecrating the temple. Now, let me give you just a little bit of, again, of that background. All of this was prophesied about in the book of Daniel. Daniel the prophet, who Jesus references, Daniel the prophet, mentions in Daniel 11:31. It actually mentions in, I think it's 4 or 5 different places in the book of Daniel. But Daniel chapter 11:31 is one of the most important ones. Here's what Daniel says, and here's what Jesus is referring to. It says, "They shall defile the sanctuary fortress, then they shall take away the daily sacrifices and place there the abomination of desolation." Now, between the end of the Old Testament, the last book in the Old Testament, the close of the Old Testament was the book of Malachi. Between the close of the Old Testament, the book of Malachi, and the time of Jesus, there is about a 400-year period. Israel was continuing on in the normal day-to-day process. They were sacrificing, they were worshiping in the temple. But what happened is that it was a very tumultuous time for those 400 years between Malachi and the rebirth of Israel, or I'm sorry, and the coming of Jesus. In that time, in that 400-year period, the people had come back from the Babylonian captivity. They were under a different domination, though. The Babylonians' power ceased, and Persia's power, the Medo-Persian Empire, began to rise up. This was also prophesied about in the book of Daniel. Daniel prophesied that this was going to happen. During that time, between the close of the Old Testament and the time of Jesus, the New Testament period, those 400 years, there's some important things that happened. A guy rose up who was a Greek king by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes was a Greek king who reigned over Syria from 175 BC until 164 BC. So an 11-year period that Antiochus Epiphanes reigned over that region. He was famous for conquering Egypt, and he was also famous for his brutal persecution of the Jews. That precipitated a revolt called the Maccabean Revolt. Antiochus Epiphanes was a ruthless ruler. He took upon himself the title of Epiphanes. His actual name was Antiochus the third, or I'm sorry, the fourth. But he took upon himself the name of Epiphanes. Epiphanes means illustrious one or God manifest. However, his bizarre, blasphemous behavior earned him another nickname from the Jews, Epimanes, which means mad one. That's what the Jews called him. There was anyway, long story short, he comes in, he takes over Jerusalem, he takes over the temple, and he actually goes into the temple. He actually enforces pagan worship in the place of Jerusalem. He forced people to worship the false gods of the Greeks. He forced people to he outlawed Jewish rituals and Jewish rites and Jewish worship. He ordered the Jews to worship Zeus instead rather than Yahweh. He tried to remove all Jewish culture from that area. He forced them to eat pigs, which was incredibly disrespectful. He encouraged them to. He wouldn't allow them to worship the way that they had always worshipped. The worst thing, though, was that he raided the temple in Jerusalem. He stole all of the treasures in the temple. He set up an altar to Zeus in the place that the altar to God was, and he started to sacrifice swine, pigs, on that altar. That was outrageous, according to the Jews. It was the most severe thing that could be done. They were profaning. He was profaning the temple of God. That was called the abomination of desolation. He worshiped and he sacrificed false gods, false idols, worshiping despicable or sacrificing despicable things on the altar of God. They were outraged by this. What happened was then the Jewish people took up arms and they began to fight. In 166, 167, 166 BC, there was a guy by the name of Judas Maccabeus. He led the Maccabeans or the Maccabees to revolt against this rule of Antiochus Epiphanes. They took back Israel. They took back Jerusalem. They began to reinstitute the worship of God. In fact, there was a miracle that happened. They wanted to relight the flame that was in the temple. They only had enough oil for one day. Miraculously, God let the flame burn for 8 days, even though they only had enough oil for one day. That became the foundation of what we know as Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights. The 8 days of Hanukkah remembers the days of the Maccabees, the 8 days that God miraculously let the light, even though they only had enough oil for one day. So, long story short, Antiochus Epiphanes is a tyrannical figure in Jewish history. He is also the foreshadowing of the coming Antichrist. The prophet Daniel predicts an atrocity in the temple in the end times. If you look at Daniel 9, 11, and 12, Daniel talked about a prophecy concerning a coming ruler who will cause the offerings to cease in the temple and to set up an abomination that causes desolation. While what Antiochus Epiphanes did certainly qualifies as an abomination, that happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It was fulfilled in what Daniel said. But Jesus, in our verses in Matthew 24, refers to in the end times, there will be another like Antiochus Epiphanes, who will be an abomination of desolation, but this time he will desecrate the third temple. There has to be a third temple restored in order for this abomination of desolation prophecy that Jesus gives to ultimately be fulfilled. Jesus speaks of Daniel's prophecy as having a still future fulfillment. The Antichrist will model Antiochus Epiphanes in his great pride, in his hubris, in his blasphemous actions, and in his hatred of the Jews. So, whomever the Antichrist is, that's the characteristics you're going to see. So, look for Israel, look to Israel, look for the rebirth of the temple. Now that Israel has been restored as a nation, 1948, 1967, 2017, three specifically important events. We could go back before that, 1917, 1867. Those, and they happen in 50-year increments. Those dates 1867, 1917, 1967, 2017, and you throw in there 1948, those specific dates are important dates in the rebirth of Israel. Now that Israel has been completely restored, now the third temple can be resurrected, it can be rebuilt and rebirthed, and then the abomination of desolation, who hates the Jews, who is very prideful, arrogant, blasphemous toward God, that person will stand in that place. Paul elaborates on this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 3 and 4. Here's what Paul says. He says, "That day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Read that for yourself. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verses 3 and 4. Here's what Paul is saying. There has to be a great falling away, a falling away of the church. The church will become more and more apostate. You see that in religious leaders today. There's a great falling away of people you thought were firmly committed to Jesus, but there will be a great falling away. Church denominations will fall away. People will reject Christ. People who had a glimpse of Jesus will refuse and reject Jesus. There will be a great falling away. Then the Antichrist will be revealed. He's called the son of perdition. The Antichrist exalts himself above all. He wants to be worshiped. He will sit in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So a third temple has to be rebuilt. It has to start redoing sacrifices, and it has to be in that place that the Antichrist shows himself. While the Antichrist is showing himself, many will fall away, many will reject Jesus, many will quit worshiping him. So Jesus says that when you see the abomination of desolation, that is the important sign. Standing in the holy place, he says, let whoever reads, let him understand. We have an ability to understand it because I believe that we are living in those days. There has to be some type of Antichrist, an actual temple, in order for the end to be fulfilled. So then Jesus warns what should be done as soon as we see the abomination of desolation. And he says, essentially, flee immediately. Now, I believe that's probably more directed at Israel than it is directed at the world, but I think there's implications for the world. The temple will be in Jerusalem. It will be in that place that people need to flee. If you're in Jerusalem and you see this happen, flee. But if you're in the rest of the world, also, if you see that happen, be prepared and flee. Make sure you're safe. Make sure that you can continue to endure. Let's look at what Jesus says. Verses 16 through 20. So these are all the verses we're going to look at for the rest of the day. Then let those who are in Judea, this is why I think it's specifically for Israel, because he's referring to Judea. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So those who are in the region of Israel, flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. And pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. So Jesus is giving the picture of what needs to happen as soon as you see the abomination of desolation, that person sitting in the place of God, in the temple of God, doing abominable acts that are going to bring the judgment of God. That's the final stage. When you see that, flee. Get out of Jerusalem. Get out of Judea. If you're in the rest of the world, watch and be prepared. Look to Israel. Israel is God's timetable. It is the most important thing that a Christian can look at to understand. When you see it, beware. And he specifically says, if you're pregnant or if you're nursing babies in those days, woe to you. And that is just a realization of, if you have to flee and you're nursing a baby, if you have to flee and you're pregnant, it's going to be difficult. So woe to you in those days. It's going to be bad. He's not saying don't have kids, don't do any of that. He's just saying it's going to be bad. It's going to be hard. Don't expect that this is going to be easy. Don't expect that the end times is going to be a cakewalk. We can hope that we are raptured as a church pre-tribulation. We can hope for that, but we have to be prepared that that's not the case. Be prepared that it is post-tribulation. Be prepared to persevere, because Jesus gave the warning in our last devotional: those who endure to the end will be saved. Don't give in. Don't give up. Continue to fight the good fight. Continue to persevere. Continue to hang on to Jesus. Continue to trust in Him. Continue to be a piece of Velcro to Him every day of your life. Just stick to Jesus. Study His Word. Don't start denying His Word. Don't start picking and choosing what you want to believe. Believe the whole of His Word. Look to Jesus. Hang on to Him. And in the end, you will be saved. So tomorrow, in our next devotional, what we're going to look at is what comes after the abomination of desolation, and that is great tribulation. Let's look at that tomorrow, starting in verse 21. Well, keep persevering. Keep knowing Jesus. Keep walking by faith with Him. Keep trusting in Him. Keep putting your faith in Him. As the world crumbles around us, as the world gets more and more difficult, as people try to reject you, as they try to cancel you, as they try to belittle you and shame you, as even they may attack you, you keep trusting in Jesus, walking by faith with Him, persevering in Him, enduring with Him, and in the end, you will be saved. James chapter 1 says, those who persevere to the end will receive the crown of life. You'll be given the victor's crown when you cross that finish line. There is more to life than this temporary world that we are in. There is eternity with Jesus in His kingdom and in His reign. Trust Him and walk with Him through that time. Well, God bless you. Have a great day. Join me back here tomorrow as we get further into Matthew 24, further looking at what's going to happen in the end.